very happy to be here with you today. Unfortunately, my Chinese is extremely limited. Excuse me. And so I will be in English today. My new best friend is AI translators. I know it sounds ironic, but one of the reasons I've worked in identifiers for so long is that English is the only language that I'm really good at. I had really hard problems studying other languages in school, and so now AI is going to take care of that for me. So let's see, did that advance there? Might depend on where I have to point it, or do I have to turn it on? It is on. It's not advancing anything. Oh, we'll let you. Oh, now it's working. Ah, right there. Down. I thought it was the up button. Translation. All right, so as was explained, I've actually been working on this area we now call decentralized identity or self-sovereign identity for 30 years. That's a very long time. That's basically my whole career. And the DID, what you now see as the W3C DID specification, was 7 of those years, or a quarter of that time, from the start of the work until it was finally approved in July of 2022, which for a piece of internet infrastructure of this importance is probably about the right amount of time. Standards take a long time. And as I held up, you might also be familiar with me through this book. We call that the Green Queen, because books from Manning always have period costumes on the title. Funny story, it took 8 months of negotiation with Manning to arrive at what we thought was, you would not believe the other period costumes that they proposed for that title. Anyway, I was very happy to acknowledge the Chinese edition that came out in 2022. And if anyone has a copy here, I am happy to sign it. All right. So today I'm going to talk about 3 topics. Now, the main topic I'll be talking about is, of course, DIDs. A little bit of history, and then there are a lot of questions about how it's evolving. Some of you may be aware, at W3C, we're just starting the 2nd cycle of the DID working group. And this time I'm an invited expert because I'm working, as you'll hear, on a bunch of other initiatives. But we just had the first face-to-face meeting at the W3C TPAC. I was not able to attend in person, but there were 30 people in the room. There's a lot of energy going into what we call the 2nd generation of DIDs. Then I want to talk about another really exciting topic that Wenjing is going to be giving a talk on tomorrow, the trust spanning protocol, how that builds on DIDs. And lastly, I'm going to introduce a brand new topic, just went public last month, called the Global Acceptance Network. That was the other title that I forgot. Anyway, that's what we'll cover here. I'll try and speak slowly, but if you have any questions or something you want specific, just raise your hand. It's a small enough group. So let's start in to talk about DIDs. We'll start out with a little history, just for anyone who might be newer to the topic. This was at the first working group meeting at the face-to-face, they asked me to give the history of DIDs, and it was the same talk I gave at the start of the working group, I think it was 5 years ago. And this is the whole background from 2015 until we chartered the first working group near the end of 2019. So this is the 5 years of work that went in to the development of of DID architecture, and through really what I considered 3 versions of the specification before we started the W3C working group. And as most of you who work with W3C know, a working group there generally has at least a 2-year life cycle. And so we felt pretty good going into the start of that working group that we had spent 5 years on a specification. I personally was sort of like, really, we're going to need another 2 years? There were a lot of implementations out there. We were well down the road. Well, it did. We used all of that 2 years. When you really boil a specification down and get it ready for international production. So I'm not going to go into details of this, but I will point out the 2 links here. The bottom one is was written, so right here, I don't know if it's got a laser pointer in it. We held the first what's called Rebooting Web of Trust conference. You may have heard of that. And the paper that came out of it, of which Vitalik Buterin, essentially the father of Ethereum, was one of, I think there are 8 of us that contributed on a paper called DPKI, Decentralized PKI. That was really where we started the whole vision of let's put the power of cryptography in everyone's hands, right? Let's decentralize the use of PKI. I highly recommend that paper because it is as current today as it was 7, 8 years ago, whatever, yeah, I guess 8 years at this point. The other one, the short URL up there, is a lot of folks are not aware that we had, there's a laser pointer here, right? Ah, it's this guy. Oh, you can't see it very well, but it's there. In the US, the Department of Homeland Security has one brilliant visionary there. His name is Anil John. I don't know, I know Wenjing knows him. He was the one who saw ahead that came, for instance, to the Internet, that's IAW's Internet Identity Workshop Conference, and said, blockchain, I get it that this is introduces a new era for what we now call decentralized identity and privacy. And so he was the one who provided DHS funding, R&D funding, research and development funding, to do the first version of the specification with my startup at the time. So that's what began forward. So this is the second round of that funding. There, yeah, was for decentralized key management. If you're going to have decentralized identifiers, you have to figure out how to do decentralized key management. It's the harder of the 2 problems. So we did another 2.5 years worth of work on that. It's all summarized in that paper up there in the corner. All right, now that's the history. I wanted to highlight this passage. I went back to the DPKI paper. Again, this is 2015. And because it, I think, perfectly summarizes the rationale behind all of what we're doing with DIDs and decentralized PKI and now decentralized identity and what at the Trust Over IP Foundation we call decentralized digital trust infrastructure, of which DIDs are the atomic building block, but there's much, much more to it. So again, I do very much recommend that paper. Now, for those of you that are very familiar with DIDs, this is going to be like reciting verses from the Bible. But when we first began the project and the architecture, and we got the funding from the Department of Homeland Security, it was because we said, these are the first identifiers that have these 4 key properties. They can be, and I want to emphasize, when I started work on this, I considered them to be persistent identifiers, what are known as URNs, uniform resource names. In the development of the specification, there was some people on the working group who said, what if we don't want it to be persistent? What if we want it to be an ephemeral identifier or something that can change over time if the controller wants it to? I hadn't really considered that, and at first I thought, no, why would we do that? But eventually I was persuaded along with the rest. So the point is, it can be persistent if you always want a DID to identify something, like URN, but you also have the choice if you want to change it. You want to change what it identifies. The identifier will not change, but what it identifies will change. So that's that first, never needs to change. Second thing is, it is a resolvable identifier, which means you can look it up to get the metadata that you need associated with it. And that's critical for the third property, which is it's cryptographically verifiable. You can prove control, and the spec uses the term did controller to just generically talk about who or what controls that did. And when I say what, you can program, for instance, a sensor to have a DID and to be able to produce communications or messages based on that DID because that private key is baked into that device. An AI bot can have a DID and prove the authenticity of its own communications. Yes, some human or company needed to set that up. But still, even though early on we thought of DIDs and you think of self-sovereign identity, you think of people. Yes, but DIDs and decentralized identification is for anything that needs it. Companies, what's now called organizational ID, super important. You would argue as important as people, but also, of course, devices, and in the age of AI bots of any kind. And lastly, where the name comes from is simply that when you don't need a centralized registry because you're generating these based on cryptographic algorithms, you no longer have to have a centralized registry. Now again, when this was conceived, we said, yes, you will never need any registries. And then we got well into, well, what does the infrastructure actually look like? Turns out there can be roles for registries, not to assign you a DID, but in general for you to have a place to register a DID in order to solve certain kinds of problems, whether it's discoverability, or it's revocation, or it's various things that need some kind of registry services. In my view, one of the key differences, though, is we will over time end up with many, many, many registries, far more than we have, for instance, even in DNS today. Because any registry, since they're not assigning the identifiers, anyone who's assigning the identifiers, a person, organization, or a bot, can register them, and that will generally be, in many cases, an automated process. So those are the 4 core properties of all DIDs. These have motivated all the work on the specification from the very start. Now this is, actually, you can tell, I grabbed this from a presentation at Evernym where I worked when we started work on all this. When we got to the final vote on the W3C spec, when we'd finished our 2 years worth of work. I don't know how many of you know it, but at the very end of the voting period, we had 3 formal objections. And we were rather surprised that the only one that was public was from Mozilla, one of the 3, big browsers. Turns out the other 2 were from the other 2. And we were like, why would the browsers be objecting to this powerful new tool for decentralizing PKI? Well, it turns out they had various reasons. One of which, and all this eventually, became public in the dialogue about it, was that there were too many DID methods. I'll get into that more, but there was, at that point, I think about 130 of them. And the browsers were saying, well, what should we support? There are too many methods. You haven't standardized any DID methods. We had to point out to them that our charter of our working group said, no standardization of DID methods. That's a topic we're going to get to in a little bit. But, so anyway, we did a webinar at that time, and we were trying to explain to a much wider audience on the internet, why are DIDs so important? Why is this a fundamental new piece of internet architecture? And all of it comes down to, and again, I'm actually going to walk up there because of the, this triangle of the relationship between the DID and a public-private key pair, this is the key right here, okay? Whatever the key pair is, and however the DID method, because any way you come up with to specify from that key pair, we're going to derive a DID, okay? On the next slide, I'll talk about a couple different ways to do that. But it doesn't matter, whatever the method is, this is the key. This is your control point. This is how an individual will exert control over, I think, generally a lot of DIDs that they have. This is how an organization, and they have to figure out their key management to manage a set of DIDs. This is how a sensor or a device or whatever, this is the control point, right? And so what the DID does is provide this constant abstraction layer that the key pair is tied to, and when you rotate keys, and the different methods all handle it differently, but you can keep this identifier. You can maintain that continuity of identity while you change key pairs and maintain the security. Does that all make sense? I hope that's really clear, because that's like, I call it the DNA of DIDs. So this is the other sort of key piece. When we did the specification, I insisted that we include an appendix that explained this, because there are many sort of trivial ways to look at DIDs and miss the fact of how this identification actually works. So again, as much for the recording as anything, I'm just going to try and make it clear. So this role of the DID controller, this is where the control will happen. That's where the private key will be managed. The metadata associated with it is the DID document. And it's quite flexible what you can actually put there. But the point is, that is not the resource. It is describing the resource you're identifying. And it can be frustrating, but the truth is, from the DID, which is almost always not human readable, you can't necessarily know what it is identifying. You have to look at the DID document and potentially look at other related information to actually determine what it's identifying, okay? That's important, because that's how you get the cryptographic properties. So we had to make it very clear, this is not the web resource. The resource you're identifying with the DID is over there. Now what the critical things that typically are in the DID document, and there are some DID methods that don't do one or the other of these things. Public keys, that's how you can do the verification, or service endpoints. Now very extremely simple DID methods like DID key, they just bundle it all in one thing. You don't actually, it's, when DID key was first proposed, I thought, is that really a DID? Turns out it's very useful to just wrap it all up in one string. But most of the methods then turn around and say, there's a way to get to a DID document. Whether that DID document is on a blockchain, it's an IPFS, it is on a web server. The web-based DID methods have become quite popular. It's up to the DID method to specify how that works. That's one of the reasons there's so many did methods. Okay, so go ahead. Sure.
Regarding the development, so I would like to know what's your original thought or the design of the, how do you come up with the idea of this development? Because in my thinking is that because we need to rotate keys so that the identifier needs to change, so you would like to find a way to keep the did persistent. So the D document, the usage of D document used to like rotate keys, and other solutions like carry KERI, it may not have the D document. So my question is about what if a decentralized identifier do not need to doesn't care if it's changed the identifiers. So do we need the D document or apart from the service endpoint and just for the key rotation part?
So first, you're right that I was surprised by there are probably at least 6 or 7 did methods that don't use a did document, like did key.
So you mean right now have 6 or 7 did methods do not have
that don't use a separate did document, right? Again, early on it was like, well, of course you're going to have a did document. How else would you solve this problem? But it turns out there are creative ways to do that. Now, you bring up KERI, that's KERI, stands for Key Event Receipt Infrastructure. It is one of the, it's actually gone from a task force, so it's now got its own working group at Trust over IP Foundation. KERI takes a very innovative approach developed by Dr. Sam Smith that said, we're going to make this identifier even smarter. We're going to pack some more information into the identifier itself. You're going to then decode that information, and that will provide the discovery for keys and endpoints without using this mechanism of a distinct did document. For that reason, they don't call it a DID. They call it an AID, an autonomic identifier. Dr. Sam Smith and Wenjing and I co-chair the Trust Spanning Protocol Task Force at Trust RP, which we'll talk about in a little bit. And so we're very, very familiar with that approach. There is a DID method called did::KERI, which simply appends a did appendix and then specifies you can take that information and produce one of these did documents. So there is a way to adapt a KERI AID to work this way. Sam Smith considers that, optional, not something you need to do. He's very opinionated about that particular kind of identifier. My view is pretty straightforward. The did document is a very, very simple container for this metadata, and therefore it's very flexible as to how it's produced. That's one reason we have so many did methods. And we'll talk about did method standardization in a minute. So that flexibility is okay as long as there's a way. If your use of the did doesn't require key rotation, that's fine. You don't have to use it. In some cases, you just need to find the service endpoint you're going to connect to. Other did methods have very advanced key rotation or multi-sig, and they have a whole set of service endpoints that might be associated to do different things if you're interacting with a person or an object or an AI. And there are a lot of different interfaces you could use. So it's a very flexible mechanism. Okay? All right. So now we'll get into where's this going? We've had the spec out now for, what, a little over 2 years, 2.5 years? I guess no, a little over 2 years. And as I said, we just had the start of the second version of the did working group. So one thing that very much surprised me, if someone had asked me when we started work on DIDs, how many DID methods would there be? And by the way, Christopher Allen, who's the co-author of the original SSL protocol to work with Netscape, he was the one who suggested the idea and the name DID method. Let's separate the DID from how you resolve it, get the DID document, and do that binding with the information in the DID document. and said that's like a method on an object, so we called it DID methods. I would have said, yeah, maybe there'll be a dozen, right? It'll be like sort of the number of URI schemes that you see in your browser, which is, in most cases, not even a dozen. It's like 4 or 5. There a few more that are more specialized ones. So I just didn't think there would be that many ways to do it. Well, it turns out, for example, the blockchain-based DID methods, pretty much every blockchain said, we need our DID method. So I would say as of the time I wrote this, and that number can change any day, there were 198 DID methods at the start of the new working group. Probably 80 to 90% of them are blockchain-based DID methods. Surprisingly, web-based DID methods have proved to be very popular. Now, at our little pre-gathering last night, I said that when I first heard about DID web, my immediate reaction was, oh, that's going to be the crack cocaine of DID methods. Really easy to get into and really dangerous. And the reason for that danger is that as originally designed, DID web will inherit both of the security vulnerabilities, DNS and DID web servers, excuse me. So it didn't, from a security standpoint, it wasn't adding anything. All it was just easy, okay? It was an easy way to get started. And we should have known that easiness was gonna turn out to be a problem, because sure enough, pretty rapidly that became the default DID method that developers started with. It was just easy to get going, right? So that last bullet there, you asked about carry AIDs. The key innovation behind those is Sam Smith saw, the really powerful thing is to make it what he called self-certifying. Self-certifying is when the DID is cryptographically tied to that original key pair. And you can verify it without talking to any external system. You literally just given the DID and the public key, and you can verify, yep, that private key is the only one with that public key that could do it. Yes.
Because I have talked to Goliath, the REI, they use relay. This is based on carry.
Yes.
The technical guy told me they also have some node around the world, like 5 or 6 nodes.
Right. But those nodes are not used in generation of carry AIDs. They solve a different problem. They're called witnesses, right? They carry witnesses. So the generation of not just a carry AID, but any self-certifying identifier takes place entirely in the wallet or the HSM, wherever the key pair is generated. If you want it to be really secure, you generate the key pair, and then you write code that basically, usually what happens is whatever metadata is packaged with the DID document, you hash that, and then you sign it, and that becomes, the hash of that becomes the DID, and then you sign that information. That's how you can cryptographically verify it. So you don't require any external system for generation of the DID, or the self-certifying identifier. Does that make sense? Where the witnesses come in.
You can consider that thing is done within a wallet.
Yes. Yes. And the advanced question you're asking is, the whole reason for witnesses is there's still an attack behind that, which is that the DID controller, the self-certifying identifier controller, can fork key rotations. They can say, here's my next key, A, and then, over here, here's my next key, B. And unless you know or can detect that they've done that, it's called duplicity detection. You're exposing an attack. It's not that you're compromising the cryptography, it's that the DID controller or AID controller went rogue, So that's what witnesses are there for, so that you can check multiple sources for the key event history. Does that make sense? So self-certifying DID methods there's a lot of interest in them because they do have these beneficial properties. You can verify them without reference to an external system, and therefore the security property is quite strong. It's also, for the same reason, portable, right? You can move it to different systems and still prove it out. So, this is a diagram I've used for a while just to broadly summarize the 3 general categories of DID methods, okay? The web-based DID methods initially, or over here, they involve, your security is HTTPS, right? It's a conventional X509 cert. All the blockchain methods fall in the middle, algorithmic, you interact with a system, that produces the DID, and as you rotate, you can verify it against that system. So if you trust that blockchain or DLT, that's where the root of trust is. Self-certifying goes all the way over to, you're trusting purely cryptography, and the only thing you need witnesses for is duplicity detection. Does that make sense? Now, the really interesting thing, and this is what happens when a standard is out there and a lot of brilliant minds start using it, is the wonderful team in British Columbia. I'm from Seattle, northwest corner of the US. Right north is British Columbia, beautiful province up there. Why they are a world leader in digital identity and decentralized identity, I have no idea. They just have been for my whole career. I've been working with them. And that team came up through we had a brainstorming session up there. John Jordan, who leads that and has been was the executive director and the chairman of the board at Trust Over IP. A lot of folks don't know he was in a tragic motorcycle accident a week after he became Cherry's quadriplegic. But he is so passionate about it that 6 weeks after that accident, he was back in touch on a Zoom with the rest of the board saying, hey, can I still be executive director, right? There were grown men crying on that call. Anyway, John is a force of nature, and he's been leading this team, and they have been using blockchain-based DIDs on the sovereign network. But for various reasons, they were saying, hey, we're thinking for long-term continuity, we're not sure any blockchain will be around long enough. It's still too early. But we are sure that there will still be web servers. There will still be, the web will still exist. So because John's quadriplegic, about once every month or two, he holds basically a little round table in his house in Victoria. And I happened to be there with about a dozen other people. And they were saying, we really like this carry thing. We like these self-certifying identifiers. Is there a way we could use them with DID web? And we were like, well, yeah, all you would do is basically what I call nesting or tunneling. You'd create a self-certifying identifier, and you'd stick it in the path of the DID web URL. And now you get the best of both. You get the ease of use of DID web, but essentially what you're doing is you're making it a discovery mechanism or a very simple witness for a self-certifying identifier. So you get all the security benefits of self-certifying identifiers with easy discoverability. That caught on. And Stephen Curran there, who works with John, they developed this method called TDW. It stands for Trusted Digital Web. I think. It always confuses me. Anyway, they first brought it up at the Internet Identity Workshop Conference last fall. There was a lot of interest. They followed up several other conferences, and then Decentralized Identity Foundation, DIF, invited them to, let's create a working group, but it's in conjunction with W3C, starting with the credential community group, a community group there, to say, hey, there's enough interest in it, and I know Anil John at DHS, that it may become essentially DidWeb 2.0, the new secure version of DidWeb. And, you know, I think it's, we're going to talk about DidWeb standardization, but I think it's one of the DID methods that really has a potential long life coming up in front of us. So in any case, if you're interested in that DID method, that's the URL right there. It's very easy to find on their site. There is a complete spec already that they, and when BCGov developed it, they didn't even announce it at IW until they had 2 implementations that they had developed. They're really serious about, show me the code, now we can proceed with the spec. So that's my hot tip on this one. Okay. Now, this is the new hot topic around DIDs. As I told you, when there were those 3 formal objections, it was largely came down to the proliferation of DID methods. What were the browsers going to be doing? They really wanted us, even though once we pointed out, well, it's not in our charter to do that, they basically said, well, then create a working group that will do that. And the current working group under its charter couldn't commit to that, but enough of us said, well, we believe that should be done at W3C and other standards bodies, wherever you want to do that standardization. It doesn't all have to happen at W3C. And they said, yeah, that's fine, you know, ITF or ISO or wherever you need to do it. So what started part of with the new working group is enough folks in the industry said, yeah, it really would help for us to take a handful of DID methods and take them through the standardization process. Really develop a lot of more confidence in those particular DID methods. If you're going to say, well, which ones? The answer is this collaborative group, and it's so the Decentralized Identity Foundation offered to basically sort of coordinate the effort, but Trust over IP, the Credentials Community Group at W3C, and IOTA all put up their hands and will be part of that. We'll all get together and basically propose DID methods, and some subset of those, I'm guessing 5 or less, will then be proposed to go into a new working group at W3C, which we're all put up our hands to vote for, right? So anyway, that process is starting. If you're interested, please do engage, and you can promote your favorite DID method. Okay, I'll conclude this section with 5 predictions. You know, Wenjing was saying, where's this going? Well, I'll quickly tell you, if you ask me, first, DIDs are not going away, right? They are here to stay, and more importantly, the growth of DIDs is going to follow hockey stick, and we are still on the very small part of that, okay? Where exactly will we hit that hockey stick? Not sure, but after we talk about where things are going, I think we're within 2 years of it really starting to take off. And 5 years from now, DIDs, they won't be as common as IP addresses, but they'll be headed in that same direction for all the reasons we're talking about here. I am a big believer in SCIDs, self-certifying identifiers. Sam Smith, the work with Kerry, it really convinced me. It's like, why not take advantage of that, right? Doesn't mean, oh, and here's an important point. Any blockchain could take their DID method and make it self-certifying. They all assumed, oh, you're going to form your DID by interacting with the blockchain. That's how all the early methods worked. But you could also create a self-certifying identifier and register it with the blockchain and get the benefits of both. So it's not just DID web that can get better. All blockchain DID methods can get better. everything can get better with self-certifying identifiers. And no, I wasn't paid to say that for anybody. All right. I don't think it will be, you won't be able to be competitive with a commercial wallet if you don't support DIDs and a reasonable number of DID methods. I actually think it'll be one of the key ways that digital wallets start to compete is which DID methods do you support? Have you built in support for? And probably most importantly, I believe that support for DIDs, DID generation and DID resolution is going to get built down at the OS level exactly the way that TCP/IP and DNS resolution got built in. In fact, if I was able to ask a question in the presentation this morning, I'd be like, is Open Harmony building it in, right? I think all the platforms will need to do this. It's, yeah. Okay, those are my 5 predictions. We can talk about those more on the panel. How am I doing for time?
You're doing great.
Okay.
We are doing great.
All right, so I'm going to briefly now talk about those other 2 topics. This is really a promo for Wenjing's session tomorrow on the trust spanning protocol. But I think it's be very obvious why is that something that we're so interested in. Right from the very outset of our work on DIDs, we said this is going to enable essentially the trust fabric of the internet because any 2 DID identified endpoints will be able to establish a trusted communications connection. All these different words are used for it. At Trust.org, we've ended up just saying, it's a relationship. That's what you're doing. You're establishing a relationship. Now, it was obvious enough that this, pattern made sense that there have been 3 different protocols. The one probably best known is called DIDCOM, right? Daniel Hardman called it that, which is a working group at Decentralized Identity Foundation. It's at version 2.1 now, entirely DID-based, right? Also at DIF, not quite as well known, is Decentralized Web Node, which is also a really fascinating protocol. Daniel Buckner, who was first at Mozilla and then Microsoft for 5 years, and then Block, the TBD division of Block, hired him. And their DWN is the basis for a decentralized payment protocol called, it's coming out of my head, TBDEX, TBDEX, TBDEX protocol. You can just TBDEX, in your browser, you can find out all about it. And that also is well into its 2nd generation. Doesn't have as wide an adoption base yet, but there's a lot of interest in it. But the most important, of course, is the trust spanning protocol at Trust.org. And I'll very briefly summarize. That is a task force within the technical side working group at Trust.org. And at a very high level, all the work of Trust.org is based on the idea that we're going to adapt the internet hourglass model, and most importantly, the idea of a spanning layer, which in the internet stack is the IP layer, that provides interoperability between all the supporting protocols and all the supported protocols above it. The whole idea of Trust.org, even the origin of the name, was we need to do the same thing for trust. And we need that spanning protocol. And yes, it's been 4.5 years, but we've laid the foundation, and we spent 6-7 months on a design principles document, and then another year on our architectural principles document, and then we finally went into the protocol design. And Wenjing will explain a lot more about that. Tomorrow, he and Sam Smith are the primary authors of the spec. I just basically do their laundry. And don't miss Wenjing's talk on it tomorrow. This is our 3rd generation picture of the Trust.org stack. If you want to study that in more depth, the Trust over IP website, trustoverip.org, has a page called Our Model, and it explains this. You can get all the graphics for it and everything. The key point about this, this is, again, the TSP layer here, a relationship between any two endpoints. And when we say any two endpoints, we really mean any two endpoints, to people, to companies, person to company, device to company, AI to person to device to company, right? Anything, it's like the IP address, cryptographically verifiable IP addresses. Separating out the establishment of a cryptographically verifiable relationship from all of what we call the trust tasks on top of that, credential exchange, well, I guess I'm getting ahead of myself. So I'll back over here. Establishing cryptographic trust at layer 2 is critical, but that does not establish human trust, okay? I can verify my communications with that other endpoint, but just like today, the criminals and crooks and terrorists can go get a Let's Encrypt certificate for the website, and yeah, you've got secure communications with a bad guy. So if you want to go above that, that's what you're doing at this layer, and the key thing you're doing there is credential exchange. And I'm careful using the term verifiable credentials because some of us use it generically. W3C says, no, when you say that, you're meaning a W3C specific verifiable credential. That's fine, so I call them digital credentials. But as I think most of you know, there's very widespread acceptance starting to happen around digital wallets and digital credentials. That's how you can establish human trust at this next higher layer. And that's why we feel this proper layering of these protocols is the reason we've been pursuing TSP, that it just handles that one piece. And I think that's all I was going to say. That actually, the final part of what I'm going to say is, when you move up to this layer, what becomes important is, how do I know who issued what credential and that they're authorized to do that? That takes us into my final point, which is the new GAN, by the way, Global Acceptance Network. It's just a generic name. I think I saw an email. We're getting very close to having the trust mark figured out, so expect an announcement, well, I'll just say between now and January, of what the long-term name will be. But anyway, Global Acceptance Network, when you're talking about digital credential exchange of any kind, this is the top half is what we call the trust triangle, issuer, holder, and verifier. Any credential, open up your wallet, every credential you have in that fits this. It's a passport, it's a driver's license, it's an employee credential, whatever. When you want to scale it, that's when you need a governing body that can say, all right, who are the authorized issuers or who are the authorized verifiers in a digital trust ecosystem? All of what we do at Trust over IP is about digital trust ecosystems. The whole model that we've created of the technology stack and the governance stack is so you can create instances of digital trust ecosystems. Good, I'm almost done. So, every ecosystem is sovereign itself, whether it's a company, a country, an industry, a church, a neighborhood. And the whole point is we need interoperability between those ecosystems, just like the internet created interoperability between our local area networks. We need to move from the internet of data to the internet of trust. And that begs the question again, how do you establish trust across those ecosystems? If they're going to be not just dozens or hundreds, but thousands or millions of those ecosystems, how do we do that? How do you know what issuers in another ecosystem are authorized? How do you know what verifiers are authorized? This is what the European Union is currently struggling through with EIDAS. What hopefully will be the largest national decentralized identity ecosystem in the world. So this is another picture, a more technically accurate one of what's going on in an ecosystem, and you can see the role of that trust registry. It is the service that you will interact with to answer that question. We need this to be as ubiquitous and as scalable as DNS. And to do that, to have a DNS for trust, well, we got to solve the same things that DNS did. And that's the purpose of the Global Acceptance Network. This is a preview for my talk on this topic tomorrow. So first you go Wenjing, then I will go. These are the companies that got together to start this work. We just started to announce it very softly on LinkedIn last month. And we're very interested in having more folks go on. And did I make it my 2 minutes?
Yes.
Excellent. That's it. Oh, there's our timings for our talks tomorrow.
Oh, yes. We will be meeting you again tomorrow on the next generation of internet track.
Yes.
Yes, we'll see you there.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. And